Hello, Robs. We're back with Dagny, Juel, Przybyszewska, The Woman and the Myth by Mary K. Norseng, a 1991 book about the muse of not only, what was his name? Now I forgot his name, Edvard Munch, but also a few other of his bohemian brohammers. Let's get on with this. Chapter 3. So it's just going to be called Dagny. Dagny, Juel, Przybyszewska. The discrepancies between myth and reality were many. If initially they may not have seemed so profound, there was little in the first 25 years of Dagny's life to suggest the fame and final tragedy of the last 6. Though it is apparent, even from the few known facts, that she hid the upbringing, the cultural background, and the personality necessary to play the mythic woman people imagined her to be. Juel. Dagny was born in Kongsvinger, I'm sure I'm botching that, Norway, on June 8th, 1867. Her father, Hans Lemmick Juel, then 27, had begun his medical practice in 1863 and would become one of the most prominent doctors and political leaders in the district. He traced his aristocratic lineage back through more than a century of Juels who had served the Danish kings in the district of Hedmark, and much further back than that through generations of high-born Juels in Denmark. Her mother, Minda Nee Blair, 22, was also from an old Hedmark family. Minda's brother, Otto Blair, would become the Norwegian prime minister to the King of Sweden-Norway in 1891, 2 years before Dagny went to Berlin. Dagny was the second of 4 sisters, closely knit as they grew up and strongly, if at times ambivalently, supportive in their later lives. The sisters, and there's one of them, Dagny at Rollighead, summer 1893. The photograph, probably taken upon Dagny's return from Berlin, seems to me to resemble closely Munch's portrait. The bonnet suggests the faint halo, the neckline and the puffed arms of the dress are similar. The head is cocked in a like manner. The arms are held close to the body, and hardly the beauty that they've portrayed her to be. Not that she's homely, but she's not exactly a raving beauty. Now back to what was the saying. The sisters were reputed to have been among the most beautiful and talented young women of Kongsvinger, since Dr. Juel was the attendant physician to the Swedish king when he visited the queen at her summer residence at nearby Ridabal, and I'm going to botch every one of these Norwegian names, so get used to it. The Juel daughters were invited to the royal parties. When the oldest of the sisters was first presented to the king, he is said to have asked if there were many pretty girls in Kongsvinger. She is said to have replied, "There are 4 of us." Funny. The Juels lived at Rollighead, Serenity, an estate on the edge of the city limits, with grounds that led down to the river Glomma. They had a large white 13-room house, 25 acres of cultivated land, large vegetable and fruit gardens, and forest land on which Dr. Juel built a shooting range and the area's first ski jump. The sisters tended to identify themselves as coming from Rollighead, not Kongsvinger. Their social life seemed to revolve around Minda Juel's sisters and brothers who lived on farms and estates in the surrounding area. Dagny's years as a girl and young woman are like a darkened landscape. The illuminating facts are so few. She had scarlet fever when she was 10. She was confirmed at the age of 15 and then traveled to Germany, apparently on a pleasure trip. The public records reveal that she completed the traditional 6 grades of school. It would have been possible for her to continue her studies, as did her older sister Gudrun, but she did not. Perhaps she had already formed her contempt for the academic. The Swedish writer Amelie Passi remembered Dagny's advice to her when they met in Lund in 1900. Passe was then a girl of only 12, aspiring to become a painter. She warned me against continuing to study with the nice old professor with whom I had just begun. She maintained that I would just grow moldy and petrify. She pronounced academic with such obvious drudgery, indeed disgust, that in her beautiful mouth it became a dirty word. I'm reading a book on Dagny Juel Przybyszewska. She was a muse of Edvard Munch, among others. In her 21st year, Dagny emerges briefly from the darkness of the past. She acted as governess to the children of her uncle Otto and aunt Randy Blair, from the fall of 1888 to the fall of 1889. Otto was then serving as district minister in the small west coast town of Ford, northeast of Bergen. The weather was harsh that winter. The nights were, of course, long, and Ford was a very small town. Dagny and her relatives were like foreign birds in an odd menagerie. As one of her aunts said, yet Dagny seemed to take to her changed world. She wrote of meeting new people, of a certain young man named Bull, of putting on plays, of staying up late with her uncle and his chess playing friends. She also wrote to her aunt Randy, who was away for a longer stay. Actually, I am at home every day. I really think it's most fun to be with the children and the piano, at home in peace. Her nieces and nephews remembered, in particular, her sense of humor and the stories she read them. Dagny herself was very fond of the children. When her year as governess was over, she wrote to her aunt, "Say hello to those sweet, good children of mine, and tell them I think about them terribly often, and tell them they don't have permission to forget me." Dagny seemed most excited, though, when she went to Bergen to visit her aunt Birgit Blair and Randy Blair's mother, whom she called Grandma Nilsson. They were equally excited to have her. After a visit from Dagny and Randy Blair in the fall, Birgit wrote, "Thank you to both you and Dagny for the breath of fresh air from Brulin. It penetrated deep into my bones. Oh yes, it was a lovely time, and surely and absolutely I'll live on it for a long time. One definitely needs to shake off all the cooking drudgery, nonsense, and that kind of thing." She invited them for Christmas. There were many beauties in town, she added. Dagny should be here. Dagny did indeed go to Bergen for Christmas. She wrote to Randy Blair upon her arrival. "Yesterday afternoon, that is, 3 o'clock, I arrived safe and sound. Uff! What weather! Terrible sea, though I managed well, namely, by being sensible enough to stay in my cabin most of the time. Bull was, of course, kindness itself, and I blessed my good fortune that sent me off in such good company. It was enormously fun to see Aunt Birgit again, and Bergen, and all of it. She was immediately swept up into the social and cultural whirl of the city, and she delighted in it. Imagine, right away last evening, I was invited by your uncle, R. Nilsson, to a grand ball. Very enjoyable to see all the city's young ladies on one platter. Honoraria Graham was charming, in an elegant gray-blue dress, and Gina's friend, Mrs. Vage, absolutely beautiful, pardon. Bull paid a visit this morning. He is supposed to have dinner with your parents today, but tomorrow he is eating here, and then he invited Aunt Birgit and me to see Czar Og Tammermand with him tomorrow evening. The opera is supposed to be both beautiful and fun, and of course, we're looking forward to it." Don't be dumb all your life. How about I change users? There you go, buddy. I gave you your wish. Dagny was having a wonderful time in Bergen that Christmas, and she did not want to leave any sooner than necessary. She wrote again to Randy on December 30th. I'm having a fantastic time, as you can well imagine. Dear Aunt, would you please send me a few words and tell me which day you want school to begin, and therefore me to come home? I would really, of course, rather stay here as long as possible. Dagny returned to Bergen a number of times during her year on the West Coast. During one such visit, with her nieces along, she wrote, last Saturday there was a party and a dance, a lot of young people and fantastically fun. I've been with Halamar Janssen several times. One day he came here to dinner with August, and since then we've continued the acquaintance. Merritt, her niece, and I are both quite taken with him. But dances and operas and people were not her only joys. She also loved playing the piano. Aunt Bridget and I were at your mother's yesterday. Unceremoniously, no one was home except your parents and Andreas and Harold. I played my whole repertoire. It was so fun to play for your mother again. Fru Nilsson enjoyed Dagny's playing just as much. She wrote to her in January 1893 as Dagny was on her way to the continent to study piano. Thank you for every time you have delighted me with your music, dear Dagny. Farewell, my dear, kind Dagny. God protect you and bless you. When you play Rubinstein, Sick, and Pierre Lawson, my favorite pieces, then think of your devoted old Grandma Nilsson. Dagny's letters from her time in Ford and Bergen reveal a young woman excited by people, parties, and the arts. Yet there was an innocence about them. They were written by a charming, loved, and protected niece, not a femme fatale. Meyer Graf's description of her years later as a member of the Schwarzviertel comes to mind. She was intelligent and witty and ready for everything, but not for this circle's most beloved preoccupation, i.e., sex. The letters also indicate that as a teenager, Dagny had seriously studied the piano and that she derived great pleasure in playing both for herself and for relatives and friends. Then, as later, she seemed to be drawn at once to both the excitement of the crowd and the calm of the intimate circle. After her year as a governess, Dagny was met by her father in Bergen, and together they sailed back to Christiana. She returned to Rolligid, I don't know how to say it, where she set up in what she called her antique room with old pieces of furniture she had acquired in Ford. But from a letter she wrote to Randy Blair upon her return, she was also spending time in Christiana. Dearest Aunt, you think I'm a terribly ungrateful, impolite creature who still hasn't written to you. Dear, don't despise me too deeply. I've been so on the go, and you know that letter writing is the weakest of all my weak sides. There was life and gaiety in Christiana. A lot of people on the street, and very fun. Are you and Uncle going to Berlin? If only you'd all come to Christmas, or Christiana instead. I have heard de Gruff twice in Christiana. You can imagine how wonderful that was. Absolutely exceptional. He played Grieg. There's Dagny and Christiana, early 1890s. Dagny was 22, in love with life and apparently intent on pursuing her piano studies. I'm going to play with the pianist Westy Walev. He is supposed to be fantastically good and talented, and most of all, he loves Grieg more than anything, and that, of course, clinched it for me. I've begun to practice with fantastic diligence. 4 hours a day, quite a bit, don't you think? Whether Dagny lived in Christiana in the early 1890s or whether she traveled back and forth between the city and Kongsvinger is not known. The latter is the likelier possibility. Family letters to Randy Blair indicate that Dagny paid extended visits to her uncles and aunts in Hedmark during that time, and when she wanted, she certainly had places to stay in Christiana. Her mother's sister, Maria Blair, ran a school for young girls in the fashionable Victoria Terrace, or is it Terrace? Terrace. And Randy and Otto Blair themselves lived in the equally fashionable Oscargate from 1889 to 1891. Invitations from her aunt did not seem to be unusual. One December in 1889 or 1890, Dagny wrote to Randy Blair on her way to Christiana from Hamar, where her father's relatives lived. You were so kind to invite Ragnhild and me to stay with you on our way home from Hamar, dear. If it is the least bit inconvenient for you, then you must definitely write and say, we're coming to the city on Thursday, the 2nd, and if you can put us up in any way possible, you would be terribly kind. So if we don't hear from you, then we're coming. You can believe we have had a lovely, fun Christmas, have danced and had fun nonstop. People have speculated that Dagny met some of the Christiana artists at the Blair home. That was certainly a possibility. Otto was a liberal politician, Randy a leading feminist, and they apparently made the artists welcome. It seems unlikely, though, that the members of the infamous Christiana Bohemia, dominated by freethinker and writer Hans Jaeger and painters Oda and Christian Krogh, were actually guests of the Blairs. In any case, there is little to link them to Dagny. She and her youngest sister, Ragnhild, were friends with the less socially aggressive group of young, aspiring artists. Ragnhild, I'm going to say it's Ragnhild, was studying voice with concert pianist Erika Nissen, who was also originally from Kongsvinger. Dagny may have been studying with Walev. Whatever their professional status, the sisters, who were extremely close, seem often to have been in the city together. They became friends with the lyric poets Wilhelm and Thomas Krogh, and Niels Collett Vogt, the pianist Arne Sem, whom Dagny would meet again in Berlin, Maya Vogt, Nils' sister, whom Dagny would also meet again in Berlin, and the writer and journalist Hjalmar Christensen. Dagny and Christensen were possibly tied romantically. He was from Ford and then studied in Bergen, graduating in 1887. Dagny may have met him either place, or she may have met him in Christiana. The only evidence of their acquaintance from the early 1890s is a photograph of the sisters with Krogh and Christensen, page 46. Next page, let's see. There they are. Nice top hats. Bruvs. What do you got, Kylie? But Dagny had two of Christensen's books with her in Poland. En Frisendet, a liberal, 1889, and Mot Blood, Tired Blood, 1891, both personally dedicated to Fröken Dagny Juel. There is no further mention of Dagny and Hjalmar Christensen until after her death in a letter from Maya Vogt to Ragnhild. Do you take Verdon's gang, HJ, what the hell do you make of that word? HJ is very productive writing articles right now. You can believe Dagny was fond of him. I met him again for the first time in Paris, and we talked a lot about Dagny. In early February 1892, Dagny went to Berlin, probably to study music. Her sister Gudrun wrote to Otto Blair in March, giving him Dagny's new address, and asserting that Dagny is extremely happy in Berlin. Nothing was heard of her there, though. No one from the later Ferkel group suggested he had met her earlier. What she did or how long she stayed is not known. If the dating of Munch's painting of Dagny and Ragnhild, two music-making sisters, is correct, she and her sister were very likely in Asgardstrand, where Munch lived and had his studio, that summer of 1892. By the fall, and probably earlier, Dagny was back at Rolliged. By the end of the year, she was restless and anxious to leave again. Dagny spent the month before Christmas, 1892, with Gudrun in Lund and caused her first public stir. She went to visit the younger members of the Professor Lidforce family, who belonged to her sister's snobbishly respectable circle. 11-year-old Hedvig Lidforce thought Dagny was sin personified. She later remembered the visit. A little party was put together in the upstairs apartment. Gerda was there, Bengt and Eric. Dagny Juel had on a long black dress that was smeared around her body like a shield. There's the photo again. Around her waist, she had a wide green crocodile sash, something we had never seen in the city before. She had makeup on, drank, and smoked like the others. Hedvig may have been shocked by Dagny, but her older brother, Bengt Lidforce, was said to have fallen in love with her. They met again a few months later in the Schwarzvierkel circle, where Lidforce came as an intimate of Strindberg. If real, Lidforce's love for Dagny was doomed from the beginning, given that he was homosexual and was suffering from syphilis. His biographers contend, regardless, that he never got over her. She seems to have treated him as a good friend, welcoming him to her and Stasha's apartment in Berlin and confiding to him her efforts to write. He, on the other hand, in party with Strindberg, generated some of the most malicious gossip ever spread about her. Resentment of her seems to have taken root even before she left for Berlin. Whether Hedvig Lidforce was really so shocked by Dagny in December of 1892, or whether, in retrospect, she enjoyed being so, is impossible to say. Her reaction to Dagny as sin personified, however, typified the reactions of those who saw in her something to fear, but many more would see in her something to inspire. Another young girl from Lund, Gudrun's friend Amelie Posse, remembered later that she was a messenger from the great world out there that lay waiting for me with all its enticing promises and unlimited possibilities. In my heart, I immediately called her Europa. It was as if that was what she represented to me most of all. Dagny's grandmother, Nilsson, wrote to her just before she left for Berlin, "A warm thank you for the picture of your sweet face. The pose is original. No one but you could have thought of turning your back to the camera. Still, nothing is lost of the face's profile. The picture is remarkable and beautiful, and remarkably like you. We all agree that it is a remarkable picture of our dear Dagny." Dagny did have a flair for the dramatic, as her photographs from the time suggest. Sometimes she would wear a high brimmed hat, sometimes an oversized bunch of dried flowers at her breast, or a big metal salamander at her throat. She would stand in side profile and she would not smile. Perhaps the dramatic poses, like her experimenting with the spelling of her name, were symptoms of the fact that she was casting about in life, looking for her direction. She was 25, unmarried, and without a cause. She was not at all political, though both Randy and Otto Blair provide potentially powerful models for her. Music was her one abiding passion, but she pursued her studies with intermittent fervor. She was anxious for artistic and social stimulation and judging from the way she responded to the Schwarz Ferkel group, existential resolution. Dagny was used to a large and loving family network. The Bohemians must have seemed her perfect forum, for they themselves were a kind of extended family into which she was welcomed. Albeit some of the most revolutionary artists of the time, they were not necessarily the most inwardly secure. Dagny, aristocratic, artistic, playful, and distinctive, lent them psychological stature, or exposed the lack thereof. They in turn confirmed her originality and desirability with an excitement she could not have imagined. Juel Przybyszewska, Europa. At Christmas time, 1892, Dagny had written Fru Nilsson that she was about to fulfill her life's dream. She was going to Paris to study piano, where her sister Ragnhild was studying voice. For whatever reason, she changed her mind in the course of 3 weeks and decided to go to Berlin. On January 26, she wrote to her uncle, the prime minister, for a consular passport, which would allow her access to cultural events in the city. I would be so appreciative. You see, I'm going to Berlin on Thursday of next week and stay down there for 3 months in order to study at Hollander's Conservatory. You can believe I'm ecstatically happy. The first week in February 1893, Dagny left Norway for Germany. The Ferkel artists propelled her into the limelight within a month of her setting foot on the European stage. Thus began the dramatic public years of her life, which ended as abruptly as they had begun when, 7.5 years later, she was shot at the age of only 33 in Tiflis near the Black Sea. If the myth was only an impossible dream, then Dagny's sensational death was its fitting end. But there was also possibility in the myth. The tragedy for Dagny lay in the discrepancy between the worshipped modern woman of the myth and the modern woman of real life. She tried to be everything: artist, free woman, wife, mother, daughter, sister, friend, literally breaking the boundaries of family within which society restricted her. Yet it was she who was broken in the process. Her geographical journey from Norway to Russian Georgia can be traced with considerable accuracy, with long stays in Berlin, then Paris, Spain, Krakow, Warsaw, and always returning home to Rolliged. Her interior journey during those few short years remains for the most part uncharted. Dagny seldom revealed her feelings, even in the few surviving letters to her family and friends. Whether out of pride, helplessness, or ennui, she remained airily silent about the ever more ill fated turns her life was taking. An overview of the events suggests her decreasing ability to control them. Her life had all the makings of a melodrama, and indeed it was one on the surface. She and Stash Przybyszewska fell in love in the spring and were married in Berlin in the late summer of 1893. Amidst constant rumors of other liaisons on both sides, they were at the same time perceived to be inseparable, their souls perfectly in tune, their strong wills as one. Ducha and Stachu were exceptional. As Ida Auerbach Demel later wrote, if you took those two into your heart, you felt yourself enriched by something you are vouchsafed to encounter only once in a lifetime. They became the king and queen of the Bohemians. Their one-room apartment in Louisenstrasse 6, their fin de siècle court, Meyer Graf described it. In the middle of the room, chairs and a table, over it, hanging from a wire, a kerosene lamp with a red paper shade, two beds, partly hidden by a kind of standing screen. They had rented a piano that could be muted, so you could play all night without disturbing the house. She played Grieg, he played Chopin. Strindberg claimed that the Schwarzviertel group soon split apart because of the rivalries Dagny engendered. Save for his own departure, however, the opposite was true, as Dagny and Stash held the group together for a time. They were its spiritual and emotional center. They agitated for the recognition of the Scandinavian artists among them. Dagny translated Sigborn Obsfelter. Stasch wrote about Edvard Munch and the sculptor Gustav Vigeland. They were the motivating force behind Pan. 1895, the most progressive European art journal of the decade, and the group's brainchild, which Dagny had named. If they were an inspiration to their friends, they were even more so. To look at that guy. Each other, Stosh wrote prolifically in his years with Dagny. He attributed his inspiration to her, used her as his model, and dedicated his works to her. He wrote that because of her, a whole new life began for me. I grew deeper, more intensive, while my consciousness was enriched with all the slumbering abilities and powers I earlier knew nothing about. Much in my soul was written with invisible ink. It only needed heat to be visible. Critics and biographers alike contend that Stosh did his finest work when he was with Dagny, and that he went into decline as a writer when his life with her ended. Stashu and Dacha, Kansvinger, 1895. The Przybyszewskas used this photograph as a postcard. Dagny herself began to write mysterious, rebellious pieces of poetry, fiction, and plays. She wrote a short story, Reda Viva, in December 1893, and sometime later a play, Den Styrker, The Stronger, that was published in Norway in 1896. By the end of the summer of 1897, she had written at least 3 more plays. She started to write lyric poems and a prose poem cycle. They had 2 children, Zenon in September 1895 and Iwa in October 1897. When Zenon was 9 months old, Dagny wrote to Munch, "My son now says mama, and that is without comparison the most interesting thing I've experienced in Norway, and he pulls out all the hair I have." Their difficulties, however, had long since begun. Stosh was a serious alcoholic. His obsessions with Satanism, sex, and drink darkened their environment. He was also a pathological liar and never to be depended upon. Dagny and Stosh were always without money, due both to their mutual unconcern and to Stosh's drinking. Some initially saw a charm in their poverty. Dagny herself was to have said that they got married because one day they just happened to have a mark, the very cost of a marriage license. Ida Demo remembered. Both of them, Statue and Dagny, entertained a bottomless contempt for all kinds of order. They found the thought of tomorrow ridiculous and unnecessary. In the spring, Dagny pawned her winter clothes and redeemed them in the fall, when she left her summer clothes instead. When we were together, pawn tickets were always falling out of her purse. This happened, of course, not completely by accident, and with childish charm she cried, "Right, Madame Issy, you will give me 2 marks before I leave." But their poverty was real. They did not always have enough to eat. Eventually, they were forced to sell their personal belongings, including their furniture, their art, and their old family things, which were so important to Dagny. Both financially and emotionally, they put themselves forever at the mercy of their family and friends. I thought she was from an aristocratic family. They often came to Rollig for long periods because they simply did not have the means to survive on their own. Sometimes Dagny would come alone. Between the time they were married in 1893 and the fall of 1898, when they moved to Krakow, she spent 33 months, or a little less than 3 of those 5 years, with her parents at Rollig. Stosh spent just over a year there, the rest of his time for the Main in Berlin. Dagny gave birth to both her children at Rollig, and she entrusted them to the care of her mother when she went off to join Stosh, whether in Berlin, Copenhagen, Paris, or Spain. She left both children for the first time when they were about 3 months old. She was apart from Zenon for almost half of his first 3 years of life, and from Iwa for almost half of her first year. Dagny never took the children with her when she went to be with Stosh. He did not see his daughter until she was over 1 year old. It was, however, not only her poverty that brought Dagny back to Rollighead. Rollighead, Rolligd. I should look that up. Let me look up Rollighead. See how it's pronounced, since I have to keep saying it. Rollighead. Rolighd pronunciation. Rollighead. How to pronounce Rollighead? Let's see. Rollighead. Rate the pronunciation difficulty. Let's hear it. Why can't I hear it? Can't hear anything.
Rolighd.
Rolighd?
Rolighd.
Rolighd. Rolighd.
Rolighd.
It sounds like Rolighd. I guess that makes sense. Lied. Rolighd. All right. Rolighd it is. Not only her poverty that brought don't keep saying it, dude. Brought Dagny back to Rolighd again and again. She was very close to all the members of her family. Inevitably, from her restless, uncertain life, she was drawn back to their peace and stability. She seemed to feel that her own children were safer with them. When she was about to leave Zenon, within months of his birth, she wrote to her Aunt Randy, "You can imagine how happy I am over my boy. I find him miraculously beautiful and sweet and handsome, and healthy he is too, which is, of course, the best thing of all. It is going to be terribly painful to leave him, but he's way too little for a long trip in the middle of the winter. He's going to stay here at Rolighd this winter, and as good a home as he has here, he can truthfully not have with me." As Rolighd drew her home, Stosh drew her away, both like invisible ropes pulling at her from opposite directions. The children became the victims of her inner tug of war. In June 1896, 3 years after Dagny and Stosh were married, their lives were shaken by real tragedy. When Stosh had met Dagny in 1893, he was involved with a young Polish woman named Marta Forder, who had already had 2 children with him. Stosh continued to see Marta after his marriage to Dagny, returning to her when Dagny stayed behind at Rolighd. Marta gave birth to Stosh's 3rd child in February 1895, the same year Zenon was born, and may have been pregnant with a 4th child when she took poison on June 9th, 1896. It is not known how Dagny responded to Stosh's relationship with Marta, or even what she knew of it. But when news of the suicide came, Dagny had only recently joined him in Copenhagen. Reunited after 3 months apart, Stosh had written to several friends that they were joyous to be together again. But they did not know what they were going to do. Marta's suicide decided for them. Together they went to Berlin, where Stosh was implicated in the suicide. Arrested and jailed for 2 weeks, he was released, but the scandal was great and would take its toll. Most of their friends, including Richard Demmel, or is it Richard? I don't know, abandoned them. They had no money, and Stosh was initially so depressed that he could not function. The picture that emerges of Dagny is a complicated one. She stood steadfastly by Stosh. They remained alone in Berlin, where she not only kept him company and cooked for him, but rewrote his manuscripts, dealt with his publishers, gave piano lessons, begged for money from their friends, and played the lottery. To the outside world, she insisted they could manage, and she always found a way to put Stosh in a sympathetic light. In a letter to Munch, written sometime in the summer of 1896, she wrote, "Dear Munch, Stachu is sick and still cannot write to you. I'm writing just a few words to answer your questions. Dear, ask no more. Ask no one about money for statue. In the first place, it wouldn't do any good, and besides, Pan has accepted something. So we're all right for the time being. It is in this letter that she also assured Munch that Stash had not used him as the model for his painter in Overboard. He was, as she said, too fond of him ever to misuse him. Meyer Graf wrote to Munch that Dagny and Stash were not all right. I have spoken to Statue and Dutcha. Things are not going well for them. Terrible. What little money they managed to scrape together, Stash spent on drink. Their rent unpaid, they were forced to vacate their Berlin apartment. Just before Christmas, they moved to Nieder Schonhausen outside the city, and though each in letters said they were enjoying being together, in the greater quiet of the suburbs, they were obviously struggling day to day. Dagny wrote to Ragnhild on the birth of Ragnhild's second son around the new year, 1896 to 97. Think that I didn't have money to send you a telegram, and it was absolutely impossible to get any. The Polish writer Alfred Wysocki was one of the few friends who did not abandon the Przybyszewskas. In his memoirs, he remembered that they had so little money that Dagny often had to sleep away hunger and cold. The atmosphere was decadent, with Stash indulging her interest in Satanism and drinking excessively. Yet Wysocki said Dagny denied Stash nothing. She made no protests when he spent in the taverns what little money they had. Stashu needs such happy moments of relaxation, Wysocki remembered her saying. Dagny at this time showed not only great loyalty to Stash, but ingenuity and courage in a desperate situation for them both. Wysocki saw her as the saving grace. She was the one who always seemed unmoved, almost cold. In spite of her unreserved, comradely way and her outspokenness, Dagny created such respect that none of us in her presence would choose to use an improper word or an indiscreet gesture. But as there is suggestion of depression in Wysocki's description, there is, in the general description of events from this time, an even greater suggestion of something helplessly obsessive about Dagny's dedication to Stash. Was it a defiant or a self-destructive woman who saw her husband through this crisis? I suggest both. She captured the ambivalence herself in one of a number of lyric poems she probably wrote at this time. I drank from your deep well one night when the moon, big and bloody, burned between the pine trees' crooked branches. I saw the eagle fly away, frightened by the moon in that gloomy gallows, and muddy the water in your clear spring, and the power I drank from your waters became poison in my healthy veins, while I waited, sitting on the runestone. Marta Forder represented Stasha's greatest betrayal of Dagny during these years, but there were others, including Dagny's friend, Maya Vogt, and there would be more. Dagny had become pregnant for the second time in January 1897. She was tired and sick and had not seen her son, who was at Raleigh with her mother, for over half a year. In March, she went home. Stash came and went again in the summer, and in October, 1 month late, she gave birth to her daughter, Iwa. The last stages of the pregnancy had been difficult, and Dagny almost died in childbirth. That summer, she had written several short plays, including one titled Nar Solen Garned, When the Sun Goes Down, about a young girl who dies from fear. She had called her protagonist Ivy, or Ivy, the name she also originally gave to her daughter. Stash professed to be distraught over Dagny's critical condition, but he remained in Berlin. In December, Dagny went to him, leaving both children with her mother. The Przybyszewskas first traveled to Paris, then to Spain in February, March, then back to Paris. In early summer, Dagny's father developed what was determined to be a cancerous tumor on his eye. All the sisters returned to Raleigh. Stosh followed several weeks later. Dr. Juel was operated on and seemed to recover, but his condition worsened in the course of the fall. In September 1898, Stosh went to Krakow to take over the editorship of Zaisi Life, the journal of the avant-garde young Poland. Dagny and the children followed him there in the late fall. The move was bittersweet. Stosh was received like a returning warlord by the adoring artist of the Krakow Bohemia, and Dagny once again was the lady, singular, enigmatic, Stosh's queen, everyone's dream. Their friends rented them a house, kept them in food and liquor, and thronged around them day and night, but Dagny's father was growing weaker. Dagny wrote to a friend shortly after her arrival that Krakow was a charming and beautiful little city, but that she was very depressed, for she could not think of anything but her father. When it became clear that he was dying, she longed to go back to Raleigh, but decided she could not do so for the sake of her children. Her sister Astrid wrote to Randy Blair on December 11th, "It is so terrible for Dagny, since it is of course impossible for her to come home. She has two small children she cannot leave, and neither does she dare to take them with her at this time of year." Dagny's mother wrote to her on December 27th, "Thank you for your telegram, which came so early in the afternoon, and gave me a feeling that you were not so far away after all. I do know that your thoughts are here, especially during this difficult time. But to hear directly from you is always a great joy. Papa's condition has, God be praised, not gotten particularly worse these past days. Especially the last week before Christmas was exceptionally good. I dread so terribly the moment that will take him from us forever, and though I know so well that it grows near and perhaps is not as distant as I hope, I cannot possibly accept that it is really so. You cannot imagine, Dagny mine, how beautiful he is as he lies here, a picture of peace and devotion to God's will, only gratitude and tenderness toward Astrid and me, who are with him." Dagny was in a foreign land in more ways than simply geographically. A friend from Krakow described the house in which she and Stosh were then living at 53 Karmelika Street. "It seemed to be a different planet," he said, "where nothing existed except art. The walls were covered by works of Munch, Goya, Wyspiansky, and on the table lay beautiful art books, unknown until then in Poland. It was an exotic land full of visitors from early afternoon until late at night. The drinking was continual. Stosh would play Chopin, and when he tired, Dagny would sit at the piano, playing Grieg and other sad melodies from Norway. One day Zenon supposedly went up to his mother and asked her what kind of tears were rolling down her face. The Przybyszewska's situation soon began to deteriorate. Stosh drank even more than before. Dagny never really learned Polish, and though she had her following of worshipping men, she was isolated from Stosh and the group as she had not been in Berlin. Her father died in January. The journal Zaisi went under. Dagny and Stosh were literally kept by their friends. Their relationship worsened, and there were betrayals on both sides. In June 1899, Stosh became involved with two other women simultaneously. One, Anelia Pajakauna, would bear him a daughter the next year. Jesus Christ. The other, Jadwiga Kasperowicz, the wife of one of Stosh's best friends and Poland's major poets, would marry him after Dagny's death. That summer, Dagny spent much of her time in the resort town of Zakopane in the mountains south of Krakow. She was said to have been seen Tadeusz Boy Zelensky, her and Stosh's good friend from the Peon Circle. In January 1900, Dagny left Stosh. Though the circumstances are unclear, the final phase of their relationship had obviously begun. They almost seemed to be engaged in some sort of terrible duet. Unable to be together, unable to part, Dagny supposedly moved into a hotel with a young Polish-French poet by the name of Vincent Brazowski. For a short time, they stayed in Krakow. Then she either took or sent Zenon to her family in Scandinavia, and Stas sent Iwa to Anila Bajakauna, his lover in Lemberg. Now, I'm obviously botching all these. Lawau. Dagny, too, visited Lemberg, where Brzezinski was living. Then she seemed to flee from one city to the next, first to Berlin with Brzezinski, then back to Krakow alone, then to Prague alone, then to Paris again to be with Brzezinski. All the while, Stas was still in the background, though the nature of the role he played is difficult to determine. He went to Berlin when he feared Dagny had gone there. He claimed that he gave money to her and Brzezinski because they were starving, that he sent her to Prague to be with friends, and that he brought her back to Krakow because she threatened to kill herself if she did not see Iwa again. Were they acting out a kind of revenge imitation play with their children and other lovers as pawns in their action? It is difficult to sort out and I will come back to this, the truth, because all the information came from Stas in letters he wrote to friends and Dagny's family. And you can see she's only around 30 or so at this point, and she looks like she's about 60. And Stas looks pretty bad himself, although he never looked particularly good to begin with. Seldom able to tell the truth and now driven to discredit Dagny, he went to great lengths to tell the story to his own advantage. She remained silent, yet they both seem to have been characters in deterioration, their emotional lives spent from too much abuse. In early May, Dagny's sister Gudrun went to Paris, apparently to convince Dagny to go home to Raleigh. Dagny returned, and she and Zenon, already there with her mother, stayed for half a year. Her prose poem cycles Sing mir das Lied Vom Leben und vom Tod, Sing Me the Song of Life and Death, was published in Norway late in the fall. The poems tell of failure and loss. She had been queen in love's kingdom, for never had any man loved a woman more than he had loved her, and now he was dead. Never more would she read in his eyes that she was the sun round which the world turned. Never more would she feel the fragrance of the flowers his love bred all about her. The flowers were now withered, and death's bony hand had torn the queen's crown from her head. As in the early 1890s, Dagny and Ragnhild spent some time together in Christiania, but they both felt times had changed. In October, Ragnhild wrote to her husband Helge, "Yes, we're actually here in Zania now, and it's rather strange, not at all like it was in the days of our youth, and not many of our old friends either. We're at a bodega with Billy on Monday, and then met Wilhelm Krog briefly, and tomorrow we're going to Hedvig's with him and his wife. We've been with Maya Vogt a lot. She's her old, sweet, kind self. Munch isn't here." And 4 days later, Maya and Dagny and I hung out together a lot, and since no one else wanted to treat us, I, of course, had to put on the treating trousers and hold an elegant soupe, I don't know how to say it, at Grand for Maya, D, and myself, with good food and fine wines that cost a lot of money. In early December, Dagny wrote Munch from Raleigh, "I've got a big favor to ask you. Won't you send me a couple of your lithographs? For example, Madonna, and especially the Scream. You've promised them to me, and I don't own a single etching, not a single lithograph of yours. You would be so fantastically kind if you would. I ask you so boldly because I know that if you don't want to send anything, then you simply won't. Ragnhild and I were at Christiana a month ago, and we so wanted to meet you. We telephoned to Holmenkollen, Grand Asgardstrand, but in vain. Whether you kept yourself hidden on purpose or whatever." She wrote again once she had gone to Warsaw. "Thank you for sending those lithographs I asked for. I'll be so terribly glad to get them. Actually, The request was in great part an excuse to hear a little from you personally. Everyone said you were sick, absolutely shy of people, and impossible to be around. And all the attempts Ragnhild and I made to get together with you in Christiana were fruitless. Christiana is an impossible place right now. They all behave like children. I was home in Norway for over half a year, but hardly 14 days in Christiana. According to Ragnhild, Dagny remained at Raleigh, waiting for Stosh to send word of his plans. She waits daily for a letter, but no letter comes. But they did decide to reconcile. First, Dagny planned to leave for Poland in October, then December. Finally, in February, she and Zenon joined Stosh in Berlin. They traveled first to Krakow, and in March, they all moved to Warsaw. Iowa was still in Lemberg. Just before they left Krakow, Dagny wrote assuringly to her mother that all was well. We're staying here in a hotel now, and as soon as Zenon's passport is issued, we'll leave the same evening for Warsaw, where our new home is already waiting for us. I am endlessly happy to be home again with Stachu. Mama, you can really be happy with us. It's beginning. No, it's already going remarkably well for us economically, and you can simply not imagine what glorious things he has written now since he's well again. 3 new plays that are now going to be performed all over Poland. A novel, Sons of the Soil, that is coming out in Przybyszewski's Przyzesh, I can't say it. Przybyszewski's, I don't know how to say it. New journal. Everyone is on their knees to him. He's worked so hard during this time that it's completely superhuman. Finished and improved, the new German editions, taken care of all those masses of corrections, written all the glorious new things as well as his lecture, which he is going to give in Warsaw as soon as we arrive. If that isn't impressive, then I don't know what is. But all was not well when Dagny, Stash, and Zenon got to Warsaw. Stash had not arranged for housing. They moved into a single room in a crowded pension. He was apparently more deeply than ever involved with Jadwiga Kasprowitz, and seldom in Warsaw, saying he was sick and unable to return to Dagny and Zenon. Stash's novel, Sinawi Zimi, about which Dagny had written so proudly to her mother, was in reality Stash's vitriolic attack on Dagny and their marriage. It had been coming out in serial form in the journal Chimera since early January. As Stash had once worshipped Dagny in his writing, he now reviled her. Everyone knew who the main characters were intended to portray. Though publication of the installments was finally stopped, Dagny had been the victim of a wicked display, and she was deeply wounded. Yet publicly she was loyal to Stash, and forever the lady. Sometime early in the spring of 1901, a Warsaw journalist met her and Stash walking on the street. Przybyszewska promenaded with a tall blonde. She was stylish and beautiful, with hair that formed a gilded halo around her face. The blonde held Przybyszewska's under his arm. When she saw me, she let go of her husband's arm, stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, lifted up her dress, and curtsied mockingly. The people around us stopped. Then she took her husband's arm again, and they walked on. It was her ironic way of thanking me for a newspaper article in which I criticized Przybyszewski's, I don't know how to say that, Przybyszewskism, but she was so charming, and the entire happening took place on such a beautiful spring day when the sun shone so enchantingly clear that I remember everything as a beautiful and poetic picture. Dagny's charming and proud presence belied her situation. In retrospect, the discrepancy was sadly disturbing. As the weeks wore on that spring, people began to see her as a haunted soul, shrouded in black, In late April, Dagny set out on her final bizarre journey. Without passports, she and Zenon left Warsaw for Tiflis in Russian Georgia, traveling by train over 1,000 miles through Russia with a young man named Vladislav Emmerich, a Pole of Russian extraction and son of a wealthy businessman. Emmerich owned a salt mine near Tiflis. Only Emmerich knew at the time that the mine was on the verge of bankruptcy. Earlier in Krakow and now again while home visiting in Warsaw, he had lavished money on her poor artist friends, in particular Dagny and Stash. Sensitive, idealistic, and emotionally unstable, he was said to have adored them both to excess. The circumstances of Dagny's departure are unknown. Some said that Emmerich was providing Dagny and Stash with a way out, that Stash was to follow, and they would then be together again in an environment far from all the pain they had suffered in Poland. Others said that Stash, never intending to follow, used Emmerich to be rid of Dagny. Ragnhild wrote to her husband Helge that if people inquired, it happened this way. Stashu, Dagny, and both children were going to live in the Caucasus for a couple of years at the invitation of the elder Emmerichs. But when Stashu still had to stay in Lemberg another month for his work, and Dagny did not want to go to Lemberg and was reluctant to stay alone in Warsaw, she decided to leave, with the young Emmerich as her escort, his parents having assured Stash that he could safely entrust his wife to his care. Dagny, Zenon, and Emmerich traveled for 3 weeks, arriving in Tiflis on May 18th. As if she were simply a tourist on an exotic trip, she had sent picture postcards along the way to Ragnhild in Stockholm, some of which Ragnhild did not receive until after Dagny's death. From the train station in Warsaw, April 26, 1901. Beloved, next station Tiflis, your own Dagny. Stash, who had accompanied her to the train, added in his own hand, Skal, Stash. From Kiev, April 28, 1901. 1,000 greetings from one of the most beautiful cities I've seen. Will write a letter from Rostov on the Asiatic Sea, your Dagny. From Tiflis, May 22nd, 1901. Dagny sent at least 6 separate cards in tandem. Only 4 have survived. 1, will write soon. Look how beautiful it is here. Address, Emmerich, Grand Hotel, Tiflis, Dagny. 2, card 1 is just the view from here, but as. 3, you see here the mountains are much higher around the city. Your own Dagny, long terribly to hear from you. At the same time, a much more desperate Dagny was sending telegrams to Stash in various cities in Poland asking for the passports he had promised to forward. She was a woman literally wiring from place to place for proof of who she was. In her last letter to him, supposedly sent the day before Emmerich killed her, she wrote, I'm about to lose my mind, not a word since a month ago. I have telegraphed to Krakow, to Lemberg, to Warsaw. No answer. I am dumbfounded, completely dumbfounded. Right up to the end, Dagny kept her worlds strangely separate. Dagny, the loving sister, and Dagny, the confused wife, seemed to have had little to do with each other. Her mother sent her a letter on June 2nd, 1901, 3 days before she died. Minda Juel was anxiously trying to reach her daughter. Your birthday is nearing, my beloved child, and I send you my warmest good wishes for your new year, hoping that this letter will reach you, though I have no definite address. So I am, in fact, sending it out into the world on a wing and a prayer. God grant that your new year be a blessed year for you, my dearest Dagny. Dagny never received her mother's good wishes. Shortly after noon on June 5th, 1901, 3 days before her 34th birthday, Emmerich shot her and then himself. Both acts were premeditated. Emmerich had left several sealed letters written in the days prior to the tragedy, explaining in particular to Stash and the 5-year-old Zenon that he had to take her life. To Stash he wrote, I'm killing her for her own sake. To Zenon, she was not of this world. She was far too ethereal for anyone to understand her true nature. Dagny was buried in Tiflis on her birthday, June 8th, 1901. As complete as the symbolism was, so incomplete was her life. And that's the end of chapter 3. I don't know why they end with her death on chapter 3, but we have a lot to go. That's it, bruvs. No one cares, but I'm here, and that's all that matters. The champ. Champ to the end.